bangs are crazy. Crazy girl bangs. I'm so excited to be here. Hey, it's Matt and welcome back to my channel. Happy New Year. My friends, how are you? I feel rejuvenated, I feel ready, and in my downtime, I've made some plans. So welcome to 2024 and welcome back to my channel. I have some things planned for you. Yeah, you specifically. Just get down to business, like this video title says. Welcome to sewing school. You and I and my cat are putting ourselves in sewing school. Because last year we did some really amazing, fun things. We taught ourselves how to sew. We dove straight into projects and we just kind of did it without like reckless abandon and just me and my gumption. You know, me, you, and my gumption, we all just kind of, and then in my downtime I went, I don't actually know what I'm talking about. Like, and I think that was the magic for some of those videos, was me just like throwing myself at something I had no idea what I was doing. But I'm a reflective person and I like knowing what I'm participating in and why I'm drawn to things and what pulls me in certain directions. I like why. So I did some investigating and realized I know nothing about sewing. I know nothing about why it exists, how it exists, when did it come about, why, like, I didn't understand. Sewing, before, like, I'm gonna get into it crazy, but sewing is one of like the longest standing arts and crafts. It really is been the cornerstone of a lot of society, not just like socially, for women especially, but for people's in expression and outward presentation, and also like declaration and rebellion and camaraderie. Like, there are so many ways that clothing and sewing have affected the world we live in and continue to affect the world we live in. So welcome to A Girl's Guide to Sewing. Let's dive in to some history. The first question I feel we need to answer is like, what does sewing mean? What is that action? Like, what do I say when I say I'm sewing something? Really, sewing boils down to, in the simplest form, joining two things together, two separate pieces together and creating a joint, whether that is fabrics or other materials using a needle and thread. It's a craft that involves joining, creating seams in order to join pieces of fabric. Now, fabric is a loose term. We have used many different things as fabric over the years. I'm using that loosely here. We'll dive into that a little later, what I mean by different fabrics. And it's really something that was done for both form and function. People needed to stay warm. People needed to cover up certain parts of the body. Things needed to be created in order for society to progress. And sewing is what made that possible. And then there's also the idea of like embroidery and lacing and all those things that created finery and expressed different levels of status or access in the world over history. But really, when you boil it down to its basic form, sewing is taking two pieces of fabric and putting them together with a stitch. That's all sewing means. So when did all this like craziness really start? Who was like, let's put these two things together and see what happens? Like, you know, like, who was the first person to like milk the cow and say, maybe we should drink this goo, you know? So when and where and what was that for sewing? Really, from everything I can gather, sewing began in the Paleolithic, I'm dyslexic, okay? Began in the Paleolithic era, okay? With all the paleo and the lithic, that era. Do you think the Paleolithic era had an Eras tour? If the Paleolithic era had to do an Eras tour, what would be in it? comment down below. I would love to know. I would love to know what the Paleolithic era's tour would look like. Okay. Really, it began sewing like animal hides and like unprocessed things together in order to create larger swaths of fabric, really to create tents, create home structures, and to create protective clothing for everybody, from either the elements, from animals, just from like day-to-day life and wear and tear. People were getting injuries, and in order to prevent that, covering themselves was the easiest way. The easiest form of protection was like having another skin. And what I thought was really cool is researchers, explorers, and discoverers have found like early sewing needles and evidence of early sewing in Siberia and China over 45, hold on, let me double check my notes. Yeah, as early as 4,500 years ago, which is crazy. Like, I don't remember what I ate for breakfast yesterday. So like the fact that this was happening 45,000 years ago, crazy. The fact that we can like figure that out, crazy, but also cool. Very, very cool. I'm into that. And back in the Paleolithic era, or 25,000 years ago in ancient China and Siberia, what they have really found and seen is that early sewing needles were made of bone to create that like skinny, sharp point that they could thread fibers and plant fibers through in order to create a needle and thread. And really, looking at it practically, sewing was driven by like this real practical need of people. It wasn't for fashion, it wasn't for expression, it was this really practical need to protect ourselves from all of those things, the elements, animals, the world around us, weather, like things like that we couldn't temperature regulate. So being covered prevents scrapes and bruises and bumps and bites, and also like prevented people from dying. Because imagine like way back then, you don't have antibiotics. This is before penicillin. Imagine a life before penicillin, okay? Before the moldy fruit, like imagine. All you've got is your little rabbit fur to protect you in the world. It feels like me walking through, like when I'm in the mall and I've just got my little latte. I feel like it's me and that latte against the world. That's what they were like with their little rabbit hides. It was just their rabbit hides and them against the world. I'm just imagining, it's very precious. And as time went on and societies evolved, fashion started to develop and people started to wear their furs and things in certain ways, or they were embroidered, and beads were added and elements were added, stones and shells and these things that meant a higher level and not just in class. I don't mean like just wealth. I mean this attention to detail and expression was being done at a higher level and has continued to like climb up until this modern era where we're putting like lobsters on ourselves. Or I think of that runway where they use the paint to turn into fabric into a dress. I think it's Bella Hadid. I'm not good with celebrities. And she walks in this like painted on fabric. Like we've evolved to the form where we're liquefying fabric and then repainting it on people. And it's crazy the level that we've been able to go through from rabbit fur to paint. It's crazy. Okay, I've talked a little bit about like people using animal hides and like natural fibers and stuff, but really what have people been using as material like since way back when? Like what were people using back in the Paleolithic era? Like what were they using to make fabrics? Because it's very different than what we're using. Well, that's a lie. I just lied. It's not much different than what we were using today. Today, we're just using more refined versions of them and more mass-produced versions throughout the world. And we also have like synthetic versions. But really, where did this start? That's what I want to know, and that's what I'm going to tell you. It really started with natural fibers, like with plant fibers, like linen and hemp being used to create fabric itself or thread even. You also think of cotton and wool and those things, like different animals that were being husbandried. That's a slave word. Animals that were being husbandried and used to create more material. And these animals that were not just food now, they also meant physical security. Now, I've mentioned the animal hides and stuff like that a couple of times. And really, when I would think about it, I would think that was like the only thing people use is like animals. Like they would skin them. I know that's not nice to think about, but it's just the truth. Like I think about leather, I think about hide, coats, like even like sheep and stuff is like what I would assume. So I did a little digging, and it's actually so much more interesting than that. And they have used so many different innovative things that like I would never have thought of, that really made progressions along the way and paved the way to what we use today in synthetics and natural fibers, and used as like the backbone of what we use for fabrics today. After bone and ivory and like naturally formed needles and thread, we moved into using metals and tools, and we were able to forge and create actual long-lasting, durable forms of needles that could then be mechanized into like modern day sewing machines and industrial sewing machines, and things that would last a long time, that weren't brittle and dry and wouldn't crack like bone and ivory, but they were able to be sustainable and longer lasting. The last like material I really want to talk about here is the one that I found the most interesting: bark. Tree bark, like from the trees outside, the trees that grow and have leaves or needles or whatever. We could use bark. Does that not blow your mind? It blew my mind. If it doesn't blow your mind, that's fine, but it blew my mind that we used bark. So I moved down here because I thought it would be cute with the fireplace and I could sit with the cats, but they all abandoned me, so there's no more cat here. That's okay. The show must go on, and it will go on with or without the feline. While I was looking all this up and was really feeling like this is like one of the coolest things people have done, like just this revelation of how important and ingrained in society it is, I was met with this sort of resistance in me saying, well, I really was trying to reconcile the two messagings that I've received. That this is so cool and so interesting and so in-depth, and just as much as an art than it is a science. Like, you can't tell me making bark into fabric isn't science and isn't like innovative and genius. And the fact that like we looked at sheep and we're like, fabric, I could wear that. That is genius to me. So how did we go from genius, super cool, cutting edge, protective, to sewing is a stay-at-home wife's job, and having sewing, be so interconnected in this traditional woman's role? And why did we lose the like brevity for it? You know, I wanted to know how we got to it being this woman's work, and not in a good way, and how and how society changed, and what that meant for women, and what it means for young women today who live empowered and who don't live under, well, we all live under the patriarchy and we all live under misogyny, but those of us who are actively fighting that in ourselves, and those of us who are actively fighting that in our relationships, no matter what they look like, actively fighting that in our day-to-day lives in order to reclaim this. So how do you reconcile that, and where does that line, where does that thread lead? I made a sewing joke. Like, looking at the 19th century, kind of this revolution of sorts where women were clothing entire nations. Looking at it this way, like throughout history, women have been so tied to sewing. They've been linked, they've been stitched to it, you know what I mean? And associated with it due to societal rules and cultural norms. And in many societies, women were the reason their families were clothed. They were in charge of making sure their families had something to wear, and they had clothes, and they were able to have that. Like, they didn't have access to Zara. You know what I mean? Like, we didn't have fast fashion yet, and women were responsible for clothing themselves and their families, and clothing their community. Like, they were really responsible for it. The ability to not only create new clothes, but to mend and repair was so highly valued, because it meant that you were protected from the elements, and it meant that you were safe, and it meant that you were able to express yourself and have different avenues and roads to go down and experience the world in. Women also passed it down this information and techniques through generations, and mothers would teach their daughters, grandmothers would teach their granddaughters, and it was this way of passing the torch in order for the next generation to be able to create, mend, and repair for their future families. And then when we think about like the Industrial Revolution, textile companies mainly had women working at them because they had smaller hands, finer detail work was also available. And then you also think about like wars when all the men got sent away and women had to do all the jobs. They had to do all of it. And those were the jobs that women kept because they were like good at, because they had been doing it for so long already. That's not to say that men can't sew and that they shouldn't sew. Anybody who is practiced and has been taught something for generations, it's more likely that that person is going to be good at it, right? So that's not to say women are inherently better at sewing, but there is and has been this cultural reverence for it and technique that has been passed down through women traditionally. So, and it's really important that we remember that these contexts were created and they were birthed from these social norms and social hierarchies and class systems that were of that time. The connection between sewing and women was rooted in social expectation. Women were expected to be able to perform this labor on top of all the other labor they did, but this was something they were also expected to do. You were expected to cook, you were expected to clean, you were expected to make your clothes, to mend the clothes, to fold the clothes, to clean the clothes. Like all of those things were expected of you. And it's really important to note that this link between sewing and women and it being a woman's job was due to the social constraints at the time and social expectations. And sewing is not women's work. It's anybody's work, anybody who wants to attempt it. I am calling this the girl's guide to sewing because I myself identify as a girl, as a woman, and I feel like those are the people I speak to. My audience, y'all, my analytics say there's 100% women here, but if you are a guy, a girl, non-binary, whatever it is, and you are interested in sewing, you can do it. It doesn't matter your gender. You don't have a predisposition. There is no such thing. So if you want to pick up a needle and thread and sew to your heart's desire. It is not just women's work. Oh, look who decided to join me. Oh, hi, baby girl. You want to say hi? How is sewing linked to feminism, Mom? And what impact did it have on domestic labor and gender roles? Very astute, Trixie. She doesn't know what any of that means. She has no idea what any of that means. Now that we have some historical context and like we kind of know how we got here and what we were using and why we did it, obnoxious. Ran down a rabbit hole and got a little obsessed with the thread between women, sewing, and feminism. I myself identify as a feminist. Hi, nice to meet ya. And my definition of feminism is us having equal right between each other and every other human being in the world in order to pursue what not only makes us happy and brings us joy, but what brings us fulfillment and what also we are here to do, and whatever that may be. I believe feminism is exclusatory. Is exclusatory a word? It's inclusive, and I consider myself an intersexual feminist. I understand that there is a crossroads between race and gender identity and what that means in the world. There is a cross between race, gender identity, and social class. I could go on. That is not what this video is about, but just so you know, my perspective looking at this and my interest in this is because I, as a woman, didn't want to sew because I thought that made me less of a modern woman. And that doesn't align with what I feel like is true. And I really wanted to dissect that and why we feel that way and look at the opposite end and how sewing has been used throughout centuries, not only for oppression, but for liberation, for rebellion, for self-expression, and how that has impacted the world and our culture we live in today. I think it makes sense to start in the domestic labor and gender roles realm Historically, sewing and domestic crafts were assigned to women because women were not in the workforce, women were not in the world. God, we couldn't have bank accounts. What else were we supposed to do? When people are confined and told they can only be one thing, of course they become that. And obviously there are outliers, and there are women all over the world and people all over the world who have pushed against that. But I'm talking about the general understanding here. Women stayed home, women cooked, cleaned, sewed, homemade, and sewing was a part of homemaking. It, like every other domestic labor, was underpaid and undervalued, if it was paid and if it was valued at all. Women were doing these things when it didn't satisfy them and didn't provide them anything back in any way, shape, or form. They were just expected to do this. I think that expectation bleeds through the reflection of it through feminism, and really shining a light to that and saying, well, I'm a feminist, I don't sew, I don't cook, I don't clean, is valid and true if that is how you feel. But I don't think it is exclusatory, and I don't feel that that resonates with my version of feminism. I think feminism means you're allowed to do whatever you want to do and what makes you happy, and I just so happen to be a woman who is independent and likes sewing. I don't think that those things are mutually exclusive, and they shouldn't be, in my opinion. If we want to look at this through the lens of economics and what value economically women have provided only in sewing, I'm talking exclusively about sewing here. In the 19th and 20th centuries, women played this huge role in building economic powerhouses for countries and civilizations, in cities, in regions, purely through sewing and the creation of clothing and other goods. And during the times of women's suffrage, sewing was a way to gain economic freedom and a first avenue that women were actually hired to do. They could be paid for this labor that they had been taught was unvalued and unpaid. They could actually go and work in a factory sewing, and it was a way for them to be not just support themselves but their families if they needed to, and give them the power to leave unsafe or unwanted situations that they would not have been able to do so before. Sewing, including like dressmaking and other materials and things like that. I'm getting stuck on the thought of like during wars when women were like making the parachutes and making all the bags for all this ammo and making gunslings and stuff like that. And women were the people who were creating these tools that were being used on battlefields, providing support in that sort of way because they weren't allowed to be there physically. This freedom, and in something that was pressured upon them, allowed them economic freedom and economic levity. You got a paycheck and you were able to spend that money, and actually it became a tangible route for women to take that wasn't just homemaking, unseen and unheard labor. And not only did women use this as a way to gain economic freedom, it was also this skill that had been ingrained in them was used to create feminism. It was used to make all the banners. It was used to create all the tools that they needed for political engagement. They were able to make new clothes and new uniforms for themselves that they didn't have to go out and buy, that weren't being provided. They were able to say things with their clothing that they would not have been able to if they didn't have control of making it for themselves. You couldn't go up and buy a banner that said, "Pay me." Like you didn't have Etsy. They were their own Etsy, and they were making these things by hand with the skills that they had been suppressed for. And in that, using these skills, they were also able to challenge beauty standards. Not only could they make a banner saying pussy power, I don't think there was a banner saying pussy power, but you know what I'm saying. They couldn't, not only that, but they were able to change the actual clothing they wore. Because another arching thing over all of this is modesty and religion and social expectations in all of that, which is inherently patriarchal. So where were you gonna buy your bikini? Girls didn't have those. I mean, I don't know, but you know what I'm saying. You couldn't buy a mini skirt. Those didn't exist. You had to make a mini skirt. Like, a girl needs a good mini skirt. Okay, that's all I'm gonna say. Sewing as an art being used in the feminist movement and today in order to reinforce and recreate what it is to express yourself, be an individual, a part of a community, and empower and embolden others around you by choosing to feel good in what you wear. I'm thinking specifically right now, dating this video, thinking about the trend of dressing as your Venus style and being more attractive. How do you do that to people? Well, for someone who knows how to sew, you can take the clothes you already have and alter them and change them in order to reflect this new trend. Or as someone who doesn't have the economic access to high-end designer clothing, but only has access to a thrift store, can go buy something and alter it and change it to have it be more reflective of who they are and what they're being. It is allowing more access and more doors and avenues to go down that previously might not have been a possibility due to the clothes that you're wearing. That was my rant. That was my feminist rant so far in 2024. I think it's so valuable and so important to know these things. I'm going to leave my rant there. I could go on and on and on about this. I hope you enjoyed this intro video. Sewing school will not always be this way. We are going to dive in and out of history and then also practical skills and how to actually approach different aspects of the sewing process of garment making. So I hope you enjoyed this. There will be more to come throughout this new year. I am so excited to be back. I would love to hear from you guys down below in the comments if you have anything to say. You know, I'm always open to your criticism, your comments, your concerns. Let me know them. I love to hear them. So I get to say my outro for the first time this year. Okay, thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you next week. Bye. Kitty time? You want a cat? This is the first cat of 2024. It's Shelby Ketchup. She's just the easiest one for me to grab. Because she's pliable. Oh. Do you want to tell the people that all you did over Mommy's break was play fetch? Say, I played so much fetch. I played so much fetch. I taught myself fetch. And she wants to play fetch at 3 a.m. She brings you the little spring embedded at your face. Okay. Say bye, friends. Bye, friends. See you, bye.